Draco Malfoy and the Truth of the Heart by Draco will hear about this. Chapter 2. Guilt and Fear. They all followed him back into the garden, pairing up and taking their places. Draco picked up the broom he had left leaning against the fence, standing with Dora but allowing himself to glance at Harry as he climbed into the sidecar of Sirius's old bike, Hagrid already sitting on it, goggles on. "Here," Dora said, distracting him as she took the luggage and fake Hedwig's cage from his hand. She performed a featherlight spell and another one to tie the luggage to his broom, still visible for the Death Eaters, but so that it wouldn't get into the way of his flying.
"Thank you,"
Draco smiled.
"All right, then," Moody called. "Everyone ready, please? I want us all to leave at exactly the same time, or the whole point of the diversion is lost."
They all mounted their brooms. Draco threw another furtive glance towards Harry and caught his eyes this time. They held the contact only for a moment as Hagrid started the engine and its sound filled the stillness of the night.
"Good luck, everyone!" Moody shouted. "See you all in about an hour at the Burrow. On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3!
And with that, they took off. Dora stayed glued to his side as they rose into the sky, and to his left he could see Hermione on her thestral with Kingsley. And then they were high enough to take off into separate directions, and Dora indicated their path with a nod. Draco had no time to turn and check for Harry once more. He could hear the roar of the motorbike becoming more distant, though, and then it was gone altogether, and they were alone. Draco glanced at Dora, who nodded, giving him a thumbs up. So far, so good. Then, though, things started to go downhill. Draco tensed when figures started to appear in his direct periphery. There were 2 of them, dark cloaked and on brooms, and they were quickly closing in on him.
"Dora!"
Draco hissed. "I know," she muttered. "Wand ready!"
Draco shook out his arm, his wand immediately falling into his palm. This had been Dora's belated birthday gift to him this summer, a wrist holster for his wand, the kind Aurors used on missions.
"I'm sure with all the trouble you get into, you can use it,"
she had told him with a smirk, and he'd had to agree with her. It sure came in handy now. The Death Eaters were now close enough to make out, and Draco's eyes widened. One of them, the larger, clearly male one, was still wearing a mask, but the slimmer female one had taken it off as she approached, a wide cat-like smirk on her familiar face. Draco had only seen pictures of his Aunt Bellatrix, and being confronted with her like this for the first time was more than a little disconcerting.
"Fedora!"
she called, her voice dauntingly sweet.
"My elusive niece! So lovely to finally meet you!"
"Can't say the sentiment is mutual,"
Dora replied, her voice remarkably even.
"Oh, I can imagine! Especially when you're out on an important mission like this. I'm surprised the Order would entrust you with valuable goods like this!"
She snorted, nodding to Draco and Harry's body.
"If he's the real deal, that is. From what I heard about you, you're rather on the clumsy side. Must be the dirty blood. Not sure they would actually trust you with their golden boy."
Draco's blood boiled at his aunt's comment, furious for Dora's sake, but Dora shrugged it off with grace, simply smiling.
"That's up to you to figure out, isn't it?" she said. "Wouldn't want to get your boss involved unless you have the real boy."
But then, quick as lightning, she fired a spell at the 2 of them. Bellatrix deflected with a shield charm, but it was enough to distract them for a moment. "Go!" Dora called to Draco, and Draco leaned onto his broom, speeding up with all that he got. He knew Dora was right behind him, still firing spells, trying to keep the Death Eaters away from them. Draco knew that it was his job to lead them out of there. If they stayed out in the open for too long, they never escaped them. He looked down, spotting a dark forest below them.
"Dora!"
he called. "Dive!" Dora did as she was told, following after him blindly, and Draco barely had time to throw a stunning spell or 2 over his shoulder before they reached the trees below them. The spells, much to his frustration, didn't connect.
"Watch out!"
Draco called as they reached the forest, making sure Dora returned her eyes to the front again, lest she crash, and the trees did provide the cover Draco had hoped for. The forest was just dark and dense enough to help them slip through the trees. They could still hear Bellatrix and her companion on their heels, of course, but the spells they fired didn't connect anymore, and they seemed to gain some distance. Draco took a sharp turn to the right, intending to outmaneuver them. Flying was his forte, after all. His aunt had been stuck in Azkaban for years. It was doubtful she could keep up with his form for long. He took another sharp right turn, glancing at Dora over his shoulder.
"What are we going to do?"
he hissed. Dora was quiet for a long moment, and then she called,
"There's a clearing over there. Land in it."
"What?"
Trust me!
They're not that far behind us.
Trust me!
And so Draco did. As soon as he reached the clearing, he jumped off the broom, turning to Dora, who landed a second after him, stumbling against his chest.
Hold tight!
She breathed, eyes wide, and Draco could already hear the sound of the Death Eaters approaching.
Don't you dare let go!
Draco felt a pulling sensation at his navel and knew that they were apparating. The last thing he saw was a curse heading their way before the scenery ellipsed and they reappeared in a quiet moonlit field. Both of them were panting, still clinging to each other, tense as they checked their surroundings. They were indeed quite alone.
Where are we?
Draco asked.
A little while off me mum's house.
Dora shrugged.
Not at all where we were supposed to go, mind you. We were meant to port key from Aunt Muriel's, like...
She let go of Draco's arm to check her watch and winced.
10 minutes ago. This was the first place that popped into my head, though.
Never mind, you saved our asses,
Draco said fiercely.
Yeah, well, you saved us first.
She shrugged.
The force was a stroke of genius, Draco, honestly.
Then she sighed.
We'll have to get to the Burrow on our own now, though. The port key from my parents' house left already, too.
Can we apparate?
He asked. Nope, too many words.
She shook her head.
I guess we could apparate a couple miles from there and then fly the rest of the way.
Let's do that then.
Draco nodded, holding his arm out to Dora again. She took it, and immediately the same uncomfortable sensation pulled him away from his current location and made him reappear in another field, this one full of rapeseed.
All right,
Dora muttered as soon as they'd caught their breaths.
Mount your broom, the others will be worried.
It took another 10-minute flight from where they had apparated to the Weasleys' home. Draco could sense it when they broke through the extensive wards. It felt like several showers, cold, warm, and icy in turn. And then the house came into view. Dora and Draco landed in the back garden, and almost immediately the back door jumped open, revealing Harry and Lupin. Draco was enveloped in Harry's arms before he had even gotten his footing. It would have made him stumble if Harry's grasp on him hadn't been tight with desperation. Draco dropped the broom to the floor, his own hands coming up around Harry's shoulders. And then Harry was kissing him with a fierceness that wiped Draco's mind blank of everything but the boy holding him. Harry had kissed him so often in the last couple of months, but he had never quite kissed him like this before. Like he genuinely thought he might never get the opportunity again, so he was now throwing himself into it with complete abandon. When Harry finally pulled away, allowing Draco to draw a shaky breath, the world was spinning for a few instances, and he had to cling on to the other boy for support. Not that it made any difference, since Harry seemed in no rush to let him go.
So what kept you?
Draco heard Lupin ask Dora, his tone almost menacing in his worry.
Bellatrix.
Dora sighed, and Draco felt Harry dead against him.
She wants me quite as much as she wants Harry, Remus. She tried very hard to kill me. I just wish I'd got her. Uh-oh, Bellatrix.
But we definitely injured Rodolphus. We were lucky to get away at all, though. If it hadn't been for Draco's clear head and his marvelous flying... You apparated us out of there, Draco interrupted her, rolling his eyes. You saved us in the end.
Yeah, well, that's my job, she deadpanned. Doesn't change the fact that you were wonderful, kiddo.
She turned back to her husband, finishing her tale.
I apparated us far from Aunt Muriel's, though, and we definitely missed the portkey by then, so we had to come by broom.
Lupin didn't return anything, but he was staring at her so hard that his eyes might as well burn holes into her head. Harry, on the other hand, loosened his grip on Draco a little, just enough to look into his eyes. His expression was haunted, and it twisted something in Draco's stomach. I'm sorry we scared you, Draco whispered.
You could have died,
Harry muttered.
Everyone was back already. Only you were missing. What was I supposed to think?
I'm sorry, Draco repeated, reaching up to run soothing fingers through his hair. I swear we're okay, though. Not even a scratch. Harry didn't say anything. He just continued staring at him, and it made Draco feel unnerved, not to mention guilty as hell. What about you? He asked. Did you run into any trouble? Harry shook his head.
Got to your hands without incident.
He shrugged.
Others ran into Death Eaters too, though. Remus and George, for instance. George got injured his ear, but he'll live.
Harry gulped, pale now, before he continued.
Hermione and Kingsley said they saw trappers, which means there was likely another mass breakout, and Mata and Ron were ambushed as well. All of them came through unscathed, though.
They really did go for all the Harrys, either on broom or with high-profile aurors accompanying them, Draco sighed. I'd say the plan was successful.
That was apparently the wrong thing to say, seeing that Harry let go of him immediately as if the words had burned him. He had no chance to apologize, though, because at that moment Hermione bowled into him from the side, apparently having lain in waiting for Harry to release him.
Oh my god! I'm so glad to see you safe!
She breathed, squeezing him tightly.
You have no idea how worried we were!
Sorry, Draco muttered into her windswept curls. Didn't mean to. She made a wet sound, almost like a sob, but when she released him, her eyes were merely glazed over, and Draco was grateful for that. He would have been unable to deal with that much emotion. You really took your time, Marcel, Ginny grumbled from his left side, hitting his bicep with not inconsiderable force, and Draco frowned as he rubbed the spot. Glad you finally made it back. I thought we had to incarcerate Harry any minute now.
We were trying our best, okay?
Draco muttered. It's not like we chose to dawdle. I know, she muttered, and her face softened. Just don't do it again, okay? You really scared the crap out of us. I'll try. Draco smiled, and she returned the smile. Let's get back inside and report to Mum and Dad. She nodded to the house, and everyone fell into step with her. Draco only noticed now that Weasley was awkwardly standing at the back door waiting for them. He nodded jerkily at Draco when their eyes met. Draco returned the gesture. Hey, Lupin said in his ear, suddenly appearing at his side, slinging an arm around his shoulder. I'm glad to see you safe. Thanks for bringing my wife back home. I told you Dora did more to save me than the other way around, Draco insisted, blushing slightly. I really doubt that's true, Draco. He smiled, squeezing his shoulder affectionately. You really need to learn to accept compliments, you know. Draco didn't answer, quite unsure how to. Lupin didn't seem to require an answer, though, because he continued, quite without Draco's input. I'm really glad you made it back safely, not only because of Tonks, but because of you. With Tonks and Harry, you're the person that I worried about the most out there today. Why? Draco asked, baffled. Because to me, you're family now, Lupin said simply, and Draco blinked at those words, realizing the truth of them. He had always felt a connection to his former teacher, but with everything going on, it hadn't quite clicked with him that his cousin's wedding had now made them actual family. And as you might realize, I don't have much of that left. I intend to cherish that, Draco. Draco smiled at Lupin, almost ashamed to admit how warm and treasured he felt at his words. His own father had rarely been very affectionate towards him even throughout his childhood. It had mostly been his mother, and later Andromeda and Dora, maybe Ted. To have Lupin openly admit to caring about him like family was something else entirely. Thanks, Draco muttered, eventually finding his voice. That means a lot to me, Professor. At that, Lupin snorted. I think you're the only one still calling me that, he teased. How about we try the first name for a change, seeing that we are family now? Draco chuckled, shaking his head. Fine, he relented. Thanks, Remus. Remus squeezed his shoulder in approval. Across the room, Draco could see Dora smiling fondly, though she was pretending not to watch them. They had now entered the burrow at last, and Draco's eyes zoomed in on George lying on the couch with most of his family scattered around him. There was a bloody hole where his ear had once been, and Draco felt sick looking as Miss Weasley gently dabbed at it with a potion-drained tissue. Fred was sitting on the arm of the couch, talking softly to his brother. "Oh, you're back!" George spoke up when he took note of Draco, smiling thinly. "Glad to see you're not dead." "Glad to not be dead," Draco returned, frowning. "Are you all right?" Fine, he waved off. "Just got some alterations done to make your daily life easier. Now you lot can at least tell us apart." Draco sent him a weak smile. "Someone should contact Kingsley," Bell noted. "He had to get back to Downing Street for the Muggle Prime Minister, but he asked us to keep him updated about you." "Yes, we also need to contact Muriel," Mr. Weasley added. "She'll still be waiting for Tonks and Draco." "I'll take care of Kingsley," Moody offered gruffly, pushing himself off an armchair to get to his feet, or foot in his case. "I wanted to check in with Hestia and Douglas anyway. One more fire crawl won't make the cauldron boil over." "Thank you, Mad-Eye," Mr. Weasley said, walking him towards the door and accompanying him outside. Draco's eyes lingered on the door as it closed before sweeping over the other occupants of the room. Dora, who was in a whispered conversation with Bill and Fleur, Hermione, who stood a little too close to Weasley, Ginny, who seemed to be discussing the apparent mass breakout from Azkaban with Hagrid, Miss Weasley, and Fred, who was still lingering with George.
and amongst them, all by himself, Harry, who was staring into space, a look of determination on his face.
Draco knew that it could be nothing good when he opened his mouth.
"I've got to go too,"
he said, and everyone fell silent, immediately turning to stare at him.
Don't be silly, Harry,
Miss Weasley said.
what are you talking about?
"I can't stay here."
Harry! Draco sighed, feeling weary. Please! Harry was rubbing his forehead, pointedly avoiding his gaze, though he did not seem to be looking at anyone else either.
"You're all in danger while I'm here,"
he said eventually.
"I don't want—"
But don't be so silly!
Miss Weasley interrupted him, clearly distraught. The whole point of tonight was to get you here safely, and thank goodness it worked. And Fleur's agreed to get married here rather than in France. We've arranged everything so that we can all stay together and look after you.
Draco knew that the remainder of the lengths they'd had to go through to ensure Harry's safety would do nothing to assuage the guilt Harry felt right now, so he quickly intervened, interrupting even as Harry opened his mouth to fight back. "Harry!" Draco said softly, shaking off Remus's arm and crossing the room to stand in front of his boyfriend, taking his hand. "I know you don't want anyone to get hurt for you, but this is a war, and people will get hurt no matter what. You have to understand that protecting you is a choice we all make willingly, fully aware of the danger it brings with it."
Honestly, stepping out of the door might earn us a killing curse in the chest nowadays, Ginny muttered.
"And right now, you're as safe here as it gets," Draco insisted. "That's right," Mr. Weasley agreed, returning to the room. "There are a dozen places you might be right now, Harry, and you know who has no way of knowing which safe house you're in." "It's not me I'm worried for," Harry exclaimed with the air of someone cornered. "We know that," Mr. Weasley answered, "but it would make our efforts tonight seem rather pointless if you left."
You're not going anywhere, Hagrid warned, glowering at him. Blimey, Harry, after all we went through to get there. "Yo, what about my bleeding ear?" George demanded, and Draco just wanted to tell them all to shut up because they were not helping. But Harry had already taken a step back from him and pushed his hand away in the process. "I know!" Harry yelled angrily. An awkward silence fell as Harry turned his back on them and picked up his trunk and Hedwig's cage to heave them up the stairs towards Weasley's room. Draco watched him go with a heavy stomach, wringing his hands nervously. "I'm going after him," he announced once Harry was out of earshot.
Do you want help?
Hermione asked tentatively, but Draco quickly shook his head.
"Better let me talk to him alone for now," Draco told her. "We both know that usually brings forth the better results." She didn't argue, and Draco followed Harry up the stairs without any protests from the others. In front of Weasley's room, he hesitated for a short moment before knocking. When there was no response, he pushed the door open, stepping inside. Harry was seated by the open window of the atrociously orange room, staring outside. Hedwig's cage was open and empty, and Harry was watching her fly off at the horizon. He had not turned on the lights, and he did not turn to look at Draco as he entered. "Hey," Draco said softly, sitting behind Harry at the little space he had left on the windowsill, moving some of Weasley's Quidditch magazines to the floor to make room for himself. His shoulder pressed against Harry's back like this, but Harry still gave no reaction. "Listen, I know you felt blackmailed down there, and I'm sorry. It's not like I don't understand what you're feeling." "But you don't," Harry bit out. "You care for us, and you don't want any of us to get hurt," Draco argued. "I think this transcends our individual situations, Harry." "Only with the small distinction that the people I care about tend to get hurt in the process of protecting me, and I'm sick of it." Draco's heart fell, and he automatically leaned a little more into Harry, trying to give comfort the only way he knew how to. "Okay, that's fair," he relented. "But Harry, pulling away from us completely and putting yourself in more danger in the process is not the solution." Harry didn't answer, but his shoulders had tensed, and Draco straightened up hesitantly, attempting to catch a glance at his boyfriend's face. "Harry," he asked, "are you still this—" But he cut himself off when he saw that Harry's face was screwed up in pain, and the next moment his hand flew up to his scar. Draco reached out to him, called his name, tried to somehow pull him back from whichever place in the Dark Lord's mind he had been pulled into. Harry started trembling violently in his arms, and his heart was racing, his breathing out of control. "Harry!" Draco called, shaking him, and finally Harry's eyes opened wide and terrified. "Are you okay?" "He was angry at the Death Eaters for letting me escape," Harry gasped, "for getting the wrong date in the first place. He tortured people. He
Harry gulped and leaned into Draco's embrace, at last accepting his comfort.
It's all right, Draco murmured. I've got you.
Harry nodded and buried his face in Draco's throat, letting Draco pet his hair and kiss his temple until the trembling had died down and his breathing had evened out. Eventually, there was a knock on the door, pulling them out of their little peaceful bubble.
Yes?
Draco said, the normal pitch of his voice now sounding strangely loud in comparison to the soft silence that had reigned between them. The door opened, and Hermione and Weasley looked inside, their faces unsure.
Draco, Tonks and Remus would like to leave, and they want to drop you off at Andromeda's along the way,
Hermione explained.
Mate, are you okay?
Weasley asked, eyes on Harry.
I'm fine.
Harry shrugged, clearing his throat as he straightened himself, effectively slipping from Draco's embrace. Draco sighed, feeling strangely bereft and a little disconcerted. Their prior discussion had been interrupted by Harry's vision, and it did not feel resolved in the slightest. What if Harry started freaking out again as soon as he was gone?
We'll talk some more tomorrow, okay?
Draco promised, leaning in to catch Harry's lips for a short, soft kiss. Harry allowed it, much to Draco's relief.
See you,
Harry whispered, green eyes cloudy. Draco sighed as he got to his feet and crossed the room. Hermione touched his arm for a moment, a look of worry in her eyes, and Draco grimaced at her before turning to leave. Thora and Remus were waiting for him downstairs, and their faces, too, were serene as he joined them.
How is he?
Dora asked. Draco just shrugged. She sighed and shook her head. Lascaux, she said, and Draco nodded. He bid his goodbyes to everyone else, and then they stepped out of the protective wards, just enough to allow them to apparate to Andromeda's. Draco had passed his examination a couple of weeks ago, along with Weasley. They had thought it smart to get that done with before taking off with Harry. They were going to be breaking enough rules as it was. One less thing to worry about. As soon as they appeared in Andromeda's living room, they were surrounded by people. His mother was the first one that got to Draco, kissing Draco's forehead lovingly and pulling him into a tight embrace. Then Andromeda fussed over him, and finally Ted ruffled his hair and offered him a fire whiskey. They all sat down for a drink as Dora retold the events of the evening for them, giving Draco a moment to just sit down and nurse his drink. His mother absent-mindedly trailed her fingers over Draco's wrist where it lay on the table, as if to ensure herself that he was actually physically back. But otherwise her eyes were fixed on her niece as she listened to her story.
I can understand what Harry's going through,
Remus said very quietly from his seat next to Draco.
It's not easy when you think you're going to be a danger to the people you love.
Draco just looked at him, unsure how to answer.
It took Tonks a long time to convince me that it's selfish to make decisions for her,
Remus sighed.
But I still have moments where What I want to say is I know why he's acting that way. Then tell me what to do to make it easier on him,
Draco pleaded. Remus smiled regretfully.
I don't think I can, he sighed. If that was a universal recipe for this, I'd love to know it myself. You can just try to convince him that you know what you're doing, and that you're better off with him than without him. If he sees that he'll cause you more pain if he leaves, he'll likely want to stay. At least that's a trick Tonks uses on me.
Draco nodded, silent for a moment before muttering,
What you said to me earlier about seeing me as family. Maybe you could say something like that to Harry too.
Remus raised an eyebrow at him, which made Draco elaborate.
Harry has lost so many people recently, and you're the last close friend of his parents he has left. Maybe it wouldn't hurt to voice it towards him what that means to you, just so that he is reminded how much people care about him outside of him being the boy who lived.
Duly noted, Remus nodded. I might have thought that by now. Me seeing Harry as family was obvious, but you're right. I should probably say it out loud. Thanks, Draco.
Don't thank me, Draco shook his head. I'll have to thank you if it makes Harry feel better.
Remus smiled sadly, shaking his head.
Here we go again, he muttered. You really can't accept compliments, can you?
Draco frowned, but didn't answer. His mother's hand tightened a little around his wrist, but only just, and she was still focused on Dora, so Draco thought it might have been a coincidence.